Good evening, everyone. I see lots of people joining. I see lots of familiar names as well, so that's really good. Hi, everybody. We've still got people joining, so I'm just going to hold off, but welcome. How are we doing, Amanda? Have we got everybody? Looks like. Just going to give it a couple more minutes. Hi, everybody. We always like to invite the guests to, if you want to pop a message into the chat box, if you want to let us know where you're joining us from. It's always great. A lot of our guests want to connect with each other. So if you want to put LinkedIn profiles, let us know what you do, where you're joining us from. It just helps to build the network, which is always what we're looking to do. Thank you all for joining. Thank you very much. Got people coming from up and down the country. Always good to see. I'm hoping for some international guests, but maybe I'm being optimistic. Let's see. Let's get this conversation global. Ireland, thank you, Brian. So please do keep putting your messages into the chat. I'm going to start. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. We're going to have a really great conversation about why fighting modern slavery is everyone's business. So Rena, our chair of the Central London branch of the Institute of Directors, has really come up with this concept to start the Let's Talk series, a really great series about tough topics that we think businesses, leaders, and directors should be talking about. And this is a really great one to start us off. And we've got a really great panel to do that on our behalf. So thank you for joining. So we're going to have a look at the agenda really quickly. So Rena's going to talk us through a little bit about joining the IoD membership. So make sure you pass these messages on through your networks. It's only through building up the network and the conversation that we can all build our own networks and get this conversation going further across the Let's Talk and other series. And we're going to do a bit of introductions. And then our moderator, Julie Etchingham, is going to be taking us through a moderated discussion about modern slavery and why it's so important to everyone in the community. Then I'll come back to what else we've got coming up. And then there'll be another session on networking and a roundtable discussion. So look out for the link for that. We'll put that up towards the end of this conversation. So please do pop your questions into the Q&A and we'll pick those up as we go if we can, or we'll pick them up at the end as needs be. So please do just keep in touch through the chat, through the Q&A, and I will hand over to Rena.
Thank you so much, Keith, and hi everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. This is such an important topic, and we're absolutely delighted that you're here with us. You've got a fantastic panel here today who're going to debate and talk about it. So I'm really pleased about it. As As Keith was talking about, this is the Let's Talk series. But before I talk about the Let's Talk series, I feel I need to take a minute, just in case any of you are not IoD members, about who is IoD and why you're here and what is this London Business Extra. So bear with me for a couple of minutes. IoD's London, as you know, is the London region for the IoD Institute of Directors, which is a membership organization. Central London is the largest branch. It's a membership community that believes in supporting each other, lobbying with the government, being able to influence and make life different and make business leaders and better directors that can create a far more fairer society, and also help in regenerating economies. So last year we started off a digital channel known as the London Business Extra webinars series, authoritative, influential, insightful, and well, the Let's Talk series is going to be all about that. We're going to spotlight issues which are challenges in helping us regenerate our economies and accelerate the growth of the UK economy at this moment of time, which we all need to. The IoD is a fellowship. There are loads and loads of opportunities and benefits for the members. You can see it out there. I would really encourage you to consider joining the IoD or perhaps sharing it with your networks, because we'd love you to be part of the business community. But let's come to today's conversation, which is really why you are here. Now, we've got a fantastic panel here with us, and in a minute, I'm going to hand over to Julie, who's going to introduce the panelists and kickstart the conversation. But may I just draw your attention that we also have with us today Roger Barker, who's the Director of Policy and Corporate Governance for the IoD, a very important person who helps us connect with the government. He will be making closing remarks, and he and I will be moderating the roundtable conversation that starts at 7 o'clock, which is really going to be inspired by the conversation that takes place right now. And on that note, let me hand over to Julie, who's of course a well-known name as a journalist and broadcaster, and also today's moderator. So Julie, over to you, and thank you for being here with us, Julie.
I'm absolutely delighted, Rena, and a huge thank you to all at the IoD, especially you, Rena, who you coordinated this so beautifully, for inviting us to present this webinar on why fighting modern slavery is everybody's business. Now, it is hard to imagine a greater social evil than modern slavery and human trafficking. The days of enslavement with chains may have gone, but almost every other feature of this pernicious crime still persists, and it persists under our noses in almost every town and city in the country, with men, women, and children coerced and controlled in slave labor. It happens in factories, on farms, in car washes, in nail bars, on ships around our shores. It happens in rented properties where women are forced into sex work, sometimes entirely out of sight, and it has only been driven deeper under in the pandemic. And crucially for our conversation this evening, it happens in supply chains, often far from these shores, sometimes on these shores, but of course with direct implications for business. And I must just say, I've reported on modern slavery for the last 15 years, and it is always a privilege when a survivor of this appalling crime is able to share their story and trust journalists with those stories. And I must say, and I know my fellow panelists will feel the same, once you've heard the story of a survivor, it never leaves you. So all of us here are deeply committed to raising awareness around this issue, and that's why it's so wonderful to share it with you this evening. So what sort of scale are we looking at when we're talking about modern slavery? We've got some slides here. I think we're all used to those in the pandemic, aren't we? The International Labour Organization, the ILO, estimates that there are around 40 million people in modern slavery worldwide, including nearly 25 million in forced labour. Of that 25 million, 16 million are exploited in the private sector, such as construction, agriculture, manufacturing, domestic work, and so on. 4.8 million are in forced sexual exploitation. 4 million are in forced labour imposed by state authorities, the most familiar, of course, currently and horrendously, the Uyghur population in China. Women and girls are disproportionately affected. And here is one of the most chilling facts in this. 1 in 4 victims is a child. The reason it's so rampant, fundamentally, it's big business. The trade in human beings generates 150 billion in profits every year for the criminal gangs who are nearly always one step ahead of all of us. What about the UK then? The scale of the crime in the UK is horrifying, and the pandemic has given cause for mounting alarm. Although Home Office figures reveal more than 10,000 suspected victims of trafficking, forced labour and slavery last year, research recently by the Centre for Social Justice suggests that figure could be 10 times higher. Now, I know this evening there will be some of you joining us who know a lot about this subject, others not so much. So we have 3 expert voices for you to give deeper insight into those statistics, as well as some action points for us all to consider. So I'm really delighted to introduce as our panel this evening, Dame Sarah Thornton, the UK's Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner. It's a role which was created under the UK's groundbreaking Modern Slavery Act in 2015. As well as focusing on support for survivors, her remit also takes in all aspects of ensuring supply chains are free of modern slavery. Baroness Helena Kennedy, leading criminal and human rights lawyer, of course. She's also director of the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, the Helena Kennedy Centre for International Justice at Sheffield Hallam University, is a thought leader in the effort to combat modern slavery. She also led Scotland's review into human trafficking. And last, but by all means not least, Sister Imelda Poole, who's joining us from Albania this evening. She's president of Renata, a network of religious across Europe working against trafficking and exploitation. She set up an NGO called the Mary Ward Loreto in Albania to address the root causes of trafficking and is involved in the rescue and rehabilitation of victims. So we are so fortunate to have Imelda with us because she is doing the work on the front line. So what I'd like to do this evening is begin by asking each of our panelists to set out what they see as the particular challenges on modern slavery as we emerge from the pandemic. And as we go, of course, we'd really love to hear your questions and your observations. Please enter them in the Q&A box or the chat box, whichever is most convenient, and I'll pick them up for our panel. And it's great to see so many here. I'm seeing people from London, Birmingham, Northern Ireland, all over the place. It's great that you're all with us. Do send in your questions. So first of all, I'm going to hand to Dame Sarah for a quick snapshot to bring us up to speed with what you think are the most pressing issues, particularly for this particular audience tonight. Dame Sarah.
Thank you very much, Julie, and good evening. And thank you to the IoD for inviting me and also for putting this event on this evening. As Julie's just said, the ILO estimate that there are 25 million people in forced labour, of whom 16 million are in the private sector. So that's 1 in 500 people. It's just all pervasive in the complex supply chains we have now. And I would argue that if you haven't found it in your supply chain, you really haven't looked hard enough. And I think absolutely, as Julie mentioned, the pandemic has highlighted the vulnerabilities of supply chains in all kinds of different ways over the last year and a half. I'd argue that global business models, in fact, with their really strong downward pressure on price, make the exploitation of workers a frequent result. Whether it's because they have these fragmented supply chains with lots of outsourcing, forced labor risks are passed down the supply chain, and brands really don't know who's working in those supply chains, which are so long and complex. So there's something about the structure of business, which I think makes us all need to act. But as you said, it's not just about international supply chains. It's not just about what happens in other countries. It's also about what happens in the United Kingdom. And one of the cases that I've spent some time looking at was known as Operation Fort. It was a case of forced labour where the criminal gang were convicted in 2019. They trafficked about 400 vulnerable people from Poland over a period of several years. And what we found after the convictions, we were looking at, well, in what businesses were these people working? And it became apparent that they were working in farms and factories, which were in the tier 1 supply chain for all our major supermarkets and DIY stores. So I wanted to make sure that business was really learning the lessons from that, because in fact, when you're talking about food supply chains, they are actually some of the most regulated, but even still, the organised crime gang penetrated and people were enslaved and were trafficked. So I wrote to the chief executive officers of the major supermarkets and the DIY stores that were involved and asked them, basically, given what's happened, what are you doing to make sure that this doesn't happen again? What are you doing in terms of your systems, processes and policies to prevent it from happening in the future? They responded to me and we published a report on that. And I recently wrote to them again to follow up sort of a year on, what else were they doing? And it seemed to me that there was a range of activity, but all of them would say that whether it's paprika, whether it's tomatoes, whether it's hazelnuts, there are particular foodstuffs in particular, which are just highly problematic when it comes to forced labour. It really still is deep in the supply chains of organisations. So it really is very much in the UK. And as I've thought about how can we put pressure on business, clearly government can legislate and there are proposals for some more legislation. But I've also more recently been focusing on investors. When, whether it's asset managers or banks, whether they're thinking of investing or lending money, what do they do in terms of due diligence before making that investment? Do they see forced labour risks as financial risks to the business? And it's interesting, over the time I've been kind of having these conversations and we're beginning to write about it, it seems to me that often modern slavery or forced labour has been seen as something to do with the social responsibility department and not at the heart of the risk management in companies, where I would argue it needs to be. And if you think about it in these terms, maybe 20 years ago, when folk were saying, look, the environment's a real risk, people said, no, it's not. Look where we are now. 10 years ago, when people were saying, cyber is a big risk, and others were saying, no, it's not. Look where we are now. And I would argue that forced labour risks in supply chains will be exactly that kind of same issue, that in 10 years' time, we'll look back and say, of course, we needed to act. Now, there's all sorts of things we need to do, but I have this sense in which it's moving in the right direction. My role as the Commissioner is to encourage good practice. And I really believe that business has a key role to play in preventing forced labour and the exploitation of vulnerable workers. And I'm really delighted that the IoD is hosting this debate tonight and has shown commitment to tackling this scourge in doing so. Thanks a lot, Julie.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and amen to that. And I'll hand straight over to Helena for her opening remarks. Hi.
Hello, and it's a great honour to be invited to this panel, and it's wonderful to see so many have from around the country have joined in tonight. I at different times, in fact, in my professional life as a barrister, came across modern slavery in the form of sexual exploitation with women brought from abroad who were being used and pimped by organized crime. And I, in fact, at one stage acted for a young woman who was present when someone else was murdered in her presence. And she ended up in the dock, but when the full extent of the background and her own enslavement became clear, she walked free from the court. But it was when I actually was asked by Scotland to go up there and head up an inquiry into whether there was any human trafficking in Scotland, because there had been no prosecutions at all. It was then I really was confronted with the full horror of it, you know, I mean, domestic servitude. I mean, who would have thought? I mean, I had come across it, people in my chambers that did some of the leading cases involving the servitude operating inside some of the embassies, you know, with embassies you bringing with them very low level servants, you know, basically, you know, maids and scrubbing people and so on from the Arab Emirates and from the Middle East and from other places. And the exploitation was terrible. Their passports would be taken from them and so on. And we had fought a number of those cases. But suddenly I was confronted with it at a very different level, which was that people who ran restaurant chains and so on, whose perhaps grandparents had come from parts of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, had gone home on holidays and would arrange with families that they would take their young with them and would pay the going rate in Bangladesh for bringing someone. And so the family were getting a reward, but of pretty low level. And then the teenagers and people in their 20s would be brought to the UK and would work all hours of the day and night, had their passports taken from them, and were basically sleeping on the kitchen floor in the way that they would have done back in places where they had come from. And suddenly they would really find that they would be asked to take the children to school one day, and they would see people that they would speak to, and then they would the story would come out. So I was coming across stories that I had never heard before, and then hearing the stories from when the police conducted raids, usually to do with drugs, organized crime. They would find that there was a sort of side area, side bar, where women had been trafficked into this country and were being used for sexual exploitation. And when we say women, some of them were very young girls and some of them were underage. So we were talking about statutory rape. It really was the thing that brought home to me the extent of this. And since that time, I have to say, I was really pleased when Theresa May, as Home Secretary, introduced the Modern Slavery Act. And we started seeing a sort of demand that the business world looked again themselves at their supply chains and so on. Now, there are certain parts of the legislation I would say is still unsatisfactory because there's no real enforcement process. Also, it only applies to the big corporates and not to public service. I mean, for example, our public services often employ cleaners at very exploitative wages and through agencies and suppliers, and pay no attention to the fact that there are people not getting living wages. The whole business of creating the equipment for the pandemic that we've just had, some of those were being produced in factories that are sweatshops inside this country. And so looking at supply chains, it should apply to the public service as well as private enterprise. And it should apply, I think, not just to big companies, but to perhaps smaller companies too. So these are issues which really touch on the humanity of people. I've just recently been involved in the whole business because of running the Institute of Human Rights for the International Bar Association. I became very informed about what was happening in Xinjiang province in China. And the forced labor that's going on there, part of what I see as being serious crimes against humanity and possibly a genocide. I would say that, in fact, we know that we have a duty in law, international law, to prevent genocide, not to wait until the genocide has taken place. And I believe that a genocide is in progress. And part of it is forced labor inside what are camps, which they say are re-education camps, but are really like concentration camps, where people are shackled. And the products, of course, are things like solar panels, which we, of course, are wanting because of the challenge of climate disaster. But also it's an area where wonderful cotton and textiles are produced, and it goes into the clothes that we're all wearing. So there are issues here about trade. And Lord Alton and myself tried to, into the trade bill, put an amendment to try and stop some of this stuff and to ask that moral question, which is, should we be trading when there are these incredible crimes taking place? So that's enough from me. But this is one of the egregious crimes that's happening in our world. And it's a challenge for all of us. None of us can be bystanders. All of us have to be heard on this.
Helena, thank you. That was brilliant. And it really points the finger very firmly to the fact that this is a crime that can involve the state. It can take in business, workers, consumers. Everybody has a stake in this, whether you're an IoD member or one of us on this panel, everybody has a stake in it. And not least those who are on the front line trying to support those women, largely, Sister Imelda, to stay in their home countries and find meaningful work so that they are not exploited and aren't tempted to go to other countries. Just talk to us a bit about this issue from your perspective on the ground there in Albania. You just need to unmute yourself, sister.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for those inspirational talks, and especially to IoD for the invitation and to be in such an honourable position to be working together against such a heinous crime in society today. I was just thrilled just a couple of days ago. I went onto the IoD website and I actually looked at their annual report. And I was so amazed that or why would I be amazed? But I was at the fact that the directives of the IoD would be our directives in the field. And yes, we're working together, you know, leadership. We desire more than anything to bring the survivors as leaders with a voice to absolutely combat human trafficking. It's always been the voice of the slave that has made a difference in the history of the abolition of slavery. And it has to be the same way today. There's agility. We're in COVID times. The traffickers are very agile. They've gone online, sexual exploitation has exploded, and we have to be as agile. We have to change our methodologies, change our ways of working, come more together. And the third directive for the IoD is responsibility. And my goodness, we have to be responsible together. All the disciplines have to work together to combat human trafficking. It cannot be in silos anymore. We know too much. It's like looking at the world from above and seeing the mess, seeing the conflict, seeing the amazing continuum from desperation to exploitation, to human trafficking, and to the incredible, massive annihilation of the voice of the human being when they're trapped in slavery. So the final directive is communication. And of course, we all know that awareness raising, advocacy, communicating, bringing everybody on board to know the truth, to listen. And that's communication. It's not just listening with our own selves, it's listening to the voice of the survivors, listening to the voice of all the NGOs and the thousands and thousands of people struggling to make a difference at grassroots, and bringing those voices together with the movers and shakers in government and in the law, which is so important to be a companion in this fight against human trafficking. And it says in the annual report that going forward, how are we going to lead using our newfound ability to pivot and adapt? How will we all take up the responsibility, not just for our business, but for the wider issues of society that we're facing today? Now, this is all of you in IoD are taking this. Now, what hope this gives us, surely, that we are going together to fight those dreadful things happening in supply chains. The UN Secretary General has said that in this post-pandemic reality, there is an exposure which has been exacerbated of global inequalities, and the path to obtaining the sustainable goals has been blocked somewhat, and it's leaving in its trail people, millions of people, at great risk of being trafficked for sexual exploitation, forced labor, and forced marriage. So the SDGs with poverty, hunger, lack of food, lack of water, clean water in Albania, we suffer from all of these, to the patriarchy, which is annihilating the freedom of women all over the world to have a voice, the droughts, the lack of decent work, the lack of universal basic income. All of these things open the doors to the traffickers. So I finish with just looking at a story of this continuum from desperation to exploitation to the desire for migration to being trafficked. And just last week, I had a phone call from somebody from Justice and Peace in Middlesbrough about a girl who had a very damaged leg, is in terrible pain, had a hospital appointment in Newcastle. In her post-NRM assessment of being trafficked, had no more time left for shelter, so had been moved on, had no asylum, was hungry and not clothed properly, so JPIC and Food Bank Middlesbrough were feeding her and clothing her, when she got a letter that day saying she was to be deported back to Albania. This was last week. And would we do something about it? She had an hospital appointment in a week's time. Before we knew it, she was down in a detention centre, or they call it a holding centre at Heathrow Airport that day, that night. And to cut to the quick, the Jesuit Refugee Service in London was called in because Middlesbrough to London is a long way. I was in Albania. She was Albanian, this girl. I was told then later on, I had many emails, many communications, she would be on a flight at 7 o'clock the next day. Now she was in terrible pain. Luckily, the Middlesbrough Justice and Peace phoned her when the officers dealing with her deportation were in the room. And they said to her, she said to the girl, show them your leg. And she heard the shock. By the next morning, she did not get on the plane. She was put in a hospital in London. But these are the scenarios. Now, we still don't know whether she's going to be deported. I could tell you story after story of the last fortnight. But please, I would say, let's follow the IoD. Let's come together. Let's look at the social issues. It's a continuum. It's not just trafficking. It's the whole thing of poverty, SDGs, not working, not happening, to exploitation, to migration, the need, and into trafficking. So I leave it there, Julie.
Thank you very much indeed, Sister. And I know that actually we're going to have a set of resources for people to refer to at the end of our conversation this evening. But I know the Mary Ward Loretto website, if people are looking to hear more stories or to really understand the work that you do, and so much of this has to be done on the ground in the countries that feed into the UK. In the dreadful sort of train of trafficking that happens. You know, if there's not grassroots work done in places like Albania, places like Nigeria in particular, I've seen that firsthand, you know, to nurture people where they are born and they need to find employment there so they're not tempted out of their communities. It is a crucial part of the jigsaw. So thank you for that. And I thank all three of you, because I think you've given us you've allowed us to look at this subject from different perspectives. I mean, I might just come back to Dame Sarah, and whilst I'm doing so, please send your questions in, because I'm keen to just mix those in as we go. But Dame Sarah, for people who are not aware, I mean, it's only really big businesses that have any obligation at all on their supply chains. What about the wider picture? And just give us a little snapshot of what the law requires companies to do.
So Baroness Kennedy referred to this, but it's Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act, which requires businesses who have an annual turnover of more than £36 million to write an annual modern slavery statement. And basically, they have to assess the modern slavery risks in their supply chains and in their own operations, and then record what steps they're taking to mitigate those risks. It is actually still an option for a company to say, we have no modern slavery or forced labour in our supply chains. So that legislation was introduced 6 years ago now, and there are more and more companies writing those modern slavery statements. It's about 17, 18,000. Nobody knows exactly the right number. Now, it was groundbreaking at the time, but lots of other places in the world have moved beyond us. Baroness makes a really good point about the public sector. And in fact, government did announce last September that the requirements will be extended to the public sector, but they've yet to come up with a piece of legislation that will do that. But at least it's been announced that that's the case. But of course, £36 million is a lot of money. It's an awful lot of smaller companies that fall beneath that. So it was a good thing. It's going to be improved, but it is limited. And the point about enforcement is a really interesting point. The idea is all of us as consumers, NGOs, will look at these statements and hold businesses to account. It's an odd sort of, I don't know, volunteer enforcement. There is a very small power that the Home Secretary has to injunct a company that hasn't written a statement, but in 6 years, that's never happened. So I'm, don't want to knock it. As far as it went, at the time, it was really good. We now need to move on, certainly in terms of modern slavery statements. But I also think that we should be looking at other legislation. I think that the import ban approach the Americans have, you cannot import cotton from Xinjiang into the US at the moment, for example. And they've used it with palm oil, with Malaysian rubber, lots of products which are notorious for forced labor. But I also think that one of the problems is that the brands, the retailers, just cascade the risk down the supply chain. They're in no way responsible or accountable. And I probably think that in the first instance, at least to make them have some sense of joint responsibility, which was an idea that the Director of Labour and Market Enforcement had several years ago, where if they haven't dealt with issues in their supply chains, then there might be some sort of naming and shaming. So I do think legislation has a role to play, but I also think that businesses can do so much voluntarily to say, we do not want to have unfair competitive advantage by exploiting people. We do not want to have unfair access to capital markets through exploiting people. And we're going to take a stand, and we're going to make sure that we require our managers throughout the world to take forced labour risks seriously and report regularly to us on that so we can get rid of it.
Thank you for that. And Helena, I might come to you because one of the points that you raised in your opening remarks was that, people can be lost in modern slavery. They can be a victim of this, with perhaps not even being aware that they are enslaved because they're desperate. They've had to make sure that they've found some means of economic survival. And also it's a crime which is hidden in a mesh of other crimes, isn't it? And I think it would be useful to hear from you about how people can sort of begin to approach understanding this when quite often trafficking is mixed up with so much other areas of crime, like drugs running, like property crime, financial crime. It's so difficult to get at this, isn't it? Could you just take your mute off?
It's going to be the word in the English dictionary this year. Unmute is the one that's been part of our lives. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I now am running this International Institute of Human Rights, and this all falls into the whole business of our common humanity. And I met Sister Imelda once we were in the United States at preparing to go to the UN, and when she tells the stories of what happened to individuals, or where I talk about individual cases, that really is what of course, that's where we, if you like, access human rights. It's through the pain of the people who suffer. And lots of it are invisible to us. In fact, if people want to, they can go onto the IBA's website, and there is a little film that we've done on business and human rights. And it's got a sort of man who looks like a lawyer, and he gets a phone call from his wife to pick up some stuff from the supermarket. And you see him, and he's in his business suit and takes his jacket off, and he goes in there to get what they need for that night. And then you see, as he takes things from the shelves, you see where they've come from and what the background might have been. And then you see him handing over the money, and you see blood coming through the basket. And it's just so vividly telling us that we ourselves as consumers have also got responsibilities in all of this. But, often, I mean, one of the things that I've been concerned about is that there was a terrible disaster, and you'll remember this, Julie, in a place called the Rana Plaza, which was in Bangladesh, and there was a building. It was basically a terrible sweatshop where many women worked, and the building was so fragile it collapsed, and many of them were killed, and many were maimed for life and rendered disabled. It was the most terrible tragedy, and it really brought home the responsibility to many. I mean, not just, you know, the sort of Primark companies selling cheap clothing, but actually high-end companies, you know, the Calvin Kleins and so on. And so suddenly there was a coming together of people in that world to say, there is a responsibility that we bear. I mean, a bit like in the 19th century, there was the Factories Acts where inspectors were sent in to make sure that the conditions were not so terrible for people who are working on looms and things. And so in the same way, we really have to have some thought about that. It's very easy not to go deep enough about supply chains. And so I would urge that I want to see a strengthening of law. And so I will be there backing up the commissioner when in the House of Lords, but when she makes some sort of suggestion as to the kind of law that would have a bit more teeth without being punitive, but to draw people into this. And I think we do need a bit more enforcement.
Yes, it's quite the big question about naming and shaming. And I know, you know, Dame Sarah, you've actually written about that quite recently, that it is time actually to have a bit more sort of, you know, a bit more conversation around making people live up to their responsibilities in this regard. We've got a couple of questions coming in. I'm just keen, because I'm always keeping an eye on the clock too, to bring those in. Ethan Turton has sent a question in. Is enough done to make consumers aware of modern slavery so they can take a stance against businesses that may be involved in it? For example, could the media do more as well as businesses themselves? Imelda, I might come to you on that one, if I may. I mean, you've spoken so passionately because you see the women that suffer, that you try to support. Where do consumers go to get information? What should be done to raise consumer awareness? What's your perspective on that? If you could unmute.
About 6 months ago, I would have, stand outside the shops with a banner and with those that are colluding with in the supply chains for cheap goods, cheap labour, cheap services, as we cry out so often from Renata and Mary Ward Loretto. But, you know, I have seen the factories in Albania which are making the goods for the Italian shoe companies, very, you know, high level names, what do they call them, the, you know, chains that are bought, you know, the ones we want to buy from. But they, you know, do we just block buying those names, or do we as consumers come together to look at the source of the injustice? Because those people need a job. They are working ridiculous hours. Most of them are sick in this shoe factory. I've met some of the guys. They are sick because they have no protective covering. They're using chemicals in making these shoes. They are very ill people after a couple of years, and they don't work in the factories anymore. So it's almost unreal to say, don't buy any of those products. We do say that, but why are we not able to, as a world, stop post-pandemic and say, you know, you IoD can help us. We have got to expose, and you are the leaders in business, so you can make sure that right down your chains there is a just way for people to work. They have decent income, decent hours, and decent conditions. That would be much more effective than not buying. Though I know it is popular to say, get an app, find out who are the unethical companies, don't buy from them, let them go bust. But we don't realize at the other end that people do need work.
Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you for that, Imelda. I'm going to put the next two questions together, actually, because they resonate very strongly with what you were just saying. Hilary Cashman's saying the fair trade mark carries certain guarantees about fair treatment of suppliers, farmers, etc. Should there be a slavery-free mark that will be recognised and valued and demanded in government contracts? And then there's a question from Shane Tiley. Hi, Shane. We have existing health and safety legislation which requires business to look after health, safety and welfare of workers. Why can this not be used further? So there are two little tools there. Sarah, perhaps I can come to you on those, especially about the health and safety legislation. It's an interesting point.
In terms of health and safety, that has been part of the response to concerns about the textile industry in Leicester last year. So when there has been enforcement activity done, the local authority who have responsibility for health and safety have been part of that enforcement activity. So you're absolutely right, that's a key way in, and not least during COVID, when companies were ignoring rules about being COVID secure. In terms of the, could we have a slave-free label? And I think it links into what Sister Imelda has just said. These supply chains are very complex. Traceability is really difficult. So if you said to a supermarket, do you buy tomatoes from Xinjiang? They'll be quite clear. There's no tomatoes coming from Xinjiang to the shelf of your local supermarket. But do they buy ready-made meals or other products that have tomato paste, where the tomato paste might have come originally from tomatoes in Xinjiang? Because you see, the supply chains are just so complex. And because of that, I think it's really very difficult to have a slave-free label, because I don't think it's as simple as there are some ethical businesses and there are some unethical businesses. I'll give you an example, and I'll use a name, I'm not advertising it, but some of you might have heard of Tony's Chocolonely, which is a very delicious chocolate, which sets itself out to be slave-free. Now, it was in the newspapers 2 months ago that while their pickers of cocoa beans in West Africa were slave-free, the place where they processed the beans wasn't. And so they were being kind of, shown up for their kind of, maybe their hypocrisy. But for me, it just illustrates how complex it is, which is why I think on the whole, what we want to be doing is through, soft power, persuading, pushing, with some more cajoling, more legislation, businesses to do the right thing. Because Sister Imelda's absolutely right. If at the first sign of trouble, the brand disinvests, the people who really suffer are the desperate folk who are working there in the first place. So what can the brands, what can tier one of the supply chain be doing to encourage better practice, more worker engagement, more enforcement, all that kind of thing?
So I just want to follow up very quickly. I mean, there may be people who are joining us in the audience today who are wondering, what do I do if I find modern slavery in my supply chain? How clearly one would hope that people want to make sure they weren't using that supplier, but in terms of what their obligations are, very briefly, and what they should do in terms of alerting a wider business community. So I'm just wondering, if somebody happens to come across it next week, completely horrified, what's the next step?
Okay, the first thing I would say is that you should have a policy or protocol for that. So you shouldn't be making up as you go along. We would say that's a key part of a business's responsibility. But at the end of the day, if it's forced labour, that is a criminal offence and you should be reporting it to the police or the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority. And then there are ways in which that can be investigated and the people protected, because we want to make sure we're protecting the victims as well as investigating the crime. So if you're talking about that sort of law breaking, then the police or the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority are your key points. But please, if you've not thought about this, it's the worst time to try and think about what to do when you're faced with the crisis. Think about it now. Talk about, there are lots of resources that could help you with that, organisations that could help you with that. Think about it now, so you've got the protocols and policies in place.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to come to you, Helena, before, I can't believe we're almost out of time, but just a very quick thought. And I know Imelda will be very interested in this as well. There is a big question about support for victims and survivors, because if victims and survivors don't feel that they're in a country where they're going to get support, and that if they raise their voices and raise their hands and go to the law authorities, that people are going to take what they say and take it on board and give them support, we aren't going to get those people out, are we?
I still feel that we haven't quite got this right. And what happens so often, and certainly was and still happens, is the tendency to try to sort of deal with this as if these are illegal immigrants, right? And so, you know, they'll say, "Where's your passport?" and so on, and they'll say they've destroyed their documentation or so on. Often it's handed over to the immigration authorities. They end up in detention centres, and you get the situations like the one that well, Sister Imelda can give you many examples, but I can too give you some, where I've met with women who they're absolutely terrified when the police suddenly they find themselves confronted with the police. There are options, you know, they could try to tell them about what's been done to themselves, but also, you see, they have families back in places who will be punished by these traffickers. These traffickers are absolutely ruthless. They will force, for example, for sexual exploitation, they will force these women to have sex with men all day long. And the women will see very little up from that. And the idea is that some of the money is supposed to be sent back to their families, to their mothers looking after their children back in places. And what they say to them is, "You want your children to live? Don't you ever speak about what happens." And so these women are absolutely in terror of what the implications will be if they actually go to the police and become a witness against those who've trafficked them. So they need to be given respite. They need to be given time. And I think that the national referral mechanism, which is about giving the women a space to go to and some time to think about then speaking out about those who've trafficked them. But I think it probably needs to be more supportive, perhaps longer. And I do think that the women have to be given certain guarantees that they will be supported and looked after, and that they might be able to be given opportunities to stay. But I'm afraid it coincided to some extent with a rather punitive system inside the Home Office with regard to immigration and so on. And you really can't confuse this. These are human rights abuses. This must not be confused with illegal immigration. That's a different issue. This is about trafficking for criminal purposes. And so we have to be able to help the people who are the victims.
Thank you very much indeed, Helena. Got a couple more comments, and then I'm going to just get a sentence from each of you to spur us all on this subject matter. Jill Rivers, hi Jill. She says, "I realise I speak as a lawyer, but I passionately believe significant step forward will be to have legislation that fits the crime. Too much reliance is placed on business owners doing the right thing." Tylee, it's also commented again, "If slavery can exist in Birmingham for Operation Fort, it can happen in dozens of countries where the more complex supply chains exist. This is a societal issue." And Francesca says, "We seem to be so fickle as consumers, so easily able to close our eyes that we continue to buy our favourite brands, clothes or foods. We need a culture change around this." She's asking a question about, and I know there's going to be a breakout session afterwards, Rena, we can take a bit more on all of these. But just to wrap this section of the evening up with my huge thanks, just come to each of our lovely panelists for a final pithy line on a call to action for all the IoD members who've given us their time and attention this evening. Sister Imelda.
I think speaking personally to the IoD, I would invite them to every single man, woman that's part of the IoD to make a commitment to personally, as a business, collaborate with a grassroots organisation working against human trafficking.
Thank you very much. That's lovely. Helena?
Well, I do want to see legal reform, and when I make that call for it, I hope that Sarah will join with me, and that we will then need the support of the public to say that something has to be done, which is much more serious, and that there have to be sticks as well as carrots to get this sorted.
Thank you, Sarah. Last word with you.
There's a lot of talk, isn't there, about the importance of building back better. And I really think we should strain every sinew to make sure building back better means that the most vulnerable workers across the globe have a much better deal and that they are not exploited in the way they are. And so that's why if you look through the detail of the G7 communique, paragraph 29, a commitment to do more work on forced labour, let's hold them to that. and let's all join together. As Sister Imelda says, we can be so powerful if we work together to support the most vulnerable people across the globe.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you so much, all three of you, such incredibly busy women committed to this amazing, important issue that we all wish to tackle. Baroness Helena Kennedy, Sister Imelda in Albania, and also, of course, Dame Sarah Thornton. Thank you very much. I'll hand you back to Rena. There you go, Rena.
Thank you so much, Julie. Really well done. What a thought-provoking conversation this has been. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and practical aspects, big challenges, actions that we can all take. I'd love to invite Roger for a few comments, and Julie, actually, I'd like to invite you back for your final comments, and I'll give you my time because I know we're going to extend this conversation for another half an hour, and Helena and Imelda, as well as you, Julie, will be joining us. So I encourage the audience for us to stay back, and we'll be sharing you a Zoom link for that one. But before that, Roger, over to you for your comments.
Thank you, Rena, and to the panelists, thank you so much for those contributions. I just was really fascinated and horrified in the same measure with everything that you had to say. I mean, what are the conclusions that I and the IoD draw from your comments? I think for me, the key point here is that directors have to take the lead in this area. I very much appreciate what Baroness Kennedy was saying, and Dame Sarah was saying about the need for legislation, the need to toughen up the Modern Slavery Act, and bring in more enforcement. But I think, as Sarah said, we as directors shouldn't wait for that. We need to act now within our organizations. We as directors are the people that are legally responsible for our organizations. So if we're not going to actually take action here, then who is? And that has to happen at a whole range of levels. I mean, it starts with us setting the right tone at the top of the company. It starts with us choosing the right person to lead the company, the CEO. What do they think about modern slavery? What's their experience been? What is their knowledge? Are they actually going to implement the right sort of policies and attitudes? And then it's about how we transform the culture of our organizations at every single level. And that's a huge task. You know, no one says that is going to be easy, but it involves looking at the policies. It involves looking at procurement and contractual decisions. It involves looking at the training of our staff. We have to think about all of these areas. And I also think that the directors themselves need training. I mean, this is a huge thing about the IoD. We believe that being a director is not just something that you suddenly slip into at the end of an executive career. It's a distinctive governance role which requires specific training, and training on this issue is all part of that. So I think, you know, the directors need more knowledge, more expertise, more awareness of this issue. On the legal front, just what I would say about that is, I do think that modern slavery legislation, it needs to be similar in nature to the law in some other areas, like anti-bribery legislation and also health and safety legislation, which basically says it doesn't protect you if you simply say you weren't directly involved in wrongdoing. You have to actually, as a director, do everything possible that you can to prevent it happening in the first place. And if you can't actually point to those actions, then it's not enough to say that you were a million miles away from where the wrongdoing occurred. You are still responsible. So I think we're going to look with great interest at this proposed legislation as it comes through, and I hope we can have a dialogue on that as well. So thank you so much to the panelists, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Roger. Thank you so much, Roger. Absolutely. And definitely, Baroness Helena, when you have that legislation working, do knock on our doors, and I'm sure Roger Barker and the team will be delighted to be able to contribute, and happy to bring the members' voice in if that's of any help in the work that you'll be putting forward. So do call upon us. Julie, back to you for a final wrap up before I hand over to Keith to wrap up today's conversation.
Okay, thank you, Rena. I was just thinking before I joined this amazing conversation with you all about a young woman that I interviewed a couple of years ago, and she'd been trafficked from the age of 5 from Vietnam into China. She was used as a drugs mule as a child, and when she was old enough, she was put to sex work. She was trafficked out of China, through Russia, where she was put to work on farms. She was there for very many years before she was taken out of Russia through Europe and into France, where she was kept in a camp, one of the notorious camps, of course, in northern France, where she was repeatedly raped. By that stage, she'd got a child. She was then put on the back of a refrigerated lorry and brought to the UK and put to work packing vegetables for a company, and she was kept living in a basement in London. And eventually, barefoot, she managed to get out, and she had treatment in hospital for what eventually turned out to be breast cancer, of which she is now thankfully cured. She was 33 years a slave, from childhood to young womanhood and beyond, with children. But she'd been rescued, she'd been supported, she'd been literally brought back to life by the NGOs who were working with her. And I was astonished to see her sitting in front of me, smiling, talking about life with hope. She was reunited with her son. It can be done. That was just one voice. And if we just go back to the statistics that we laid out at the top of our conversation, it just gives you a sense of the scale of what we are up against and what we need to commit ourselves to. And it literally falls to every single one of us. Whatever walk of life, whatever business, whatever public sector job we do, whatever NGO we work for, it is down to all of us, because it is part of the way the economy works across the globe. And it is an economy which is now under huge pressure as we come out of the pandemic. So we couldn't be having this conversation, all of us tonight, at a better time. And I can't tell you how thrilled we are that the IoD invited us to this as part of your conversations as we come out of the pandemic. Thank you. Let's just all work together on it.
Thank you very much, Julie. Really appreciate that. I think so. You're very right. We need to talk more about such topics, because the problem is we have these conversations and then they go to the back room while we think about more important things like business bottom line. So I'm glad that we're having these conversations. Keith, over to you for our wrap up. And I know that we're going to extend the conversation. So let us know how we can continue this conversation. Oh, Keith, for some reason, we can't hear you. Oh, And I know that there are a couple of slides as well. So Amanda, if you're around here with us, yeah, okay, all right. And Keith, in case.
Is that better?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Thank you very much. So I have just popped the link for the next session into the chat, but just before we go, we have more coming up. So on our Business Extra calendar, we've got our ERP digital group talking about the last mile, so how we connect data to drive intelligent enterprise. And then on the 29th of June, the UK Philippines opportunities for business growth collaboration. 5th of July, we're talking to the Trade Commissioner for the Middle East, and we continue our Let's Talk series. So these kinds of conversations that need to happen in businesses. So on the 14th of July, we've got Lessons from Inside number 10, and that's a members only event. 28th of July, Sustainability Greenwashing. So there's lots more to come. So for those that can't stay on, from my side, thank you so much to Julie for moderating, to the panelists. Heartbreaking and inspiring stories. So let's keep it going in the link here on your screen or in the chat. I'm going to wrap it up. So we'll do your countdown and hopefully we can see you all in the next room shortly. Thank you all so much again. Copy that link, paste it, click on it. Give it a few more seconds. Do a countdown of 5, 4, 3. Thank you so much. We'll see you soon. 2, 1. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye for now. See you soon.